Alright everyone, let's go ahead and get started talking about vulnerability scanning. This is chapter 4 in the pen test book. And just a couple things that are good to know before we kind of get into the chapter here. There's a couple things that you should be aware of. First of all, we did some scanning in the first half of this class, and I think that for the sort of demonstrations that we walked through, most of you were aware that even if you're scanning all the ports on just one computer, well, that's a substantial number of ports. So if you're doing this on any sort of corporate network or doing a penetration test of any size, a couple things are pretty important. First of all, you're going to need to make sure that you have automated as many of your tests as you can. You don't want to have to do all of these manual scans. You're going to need to be really organized, just as sort of a general way of approaching this. You need to be able to record all the results in a way that's that you can get to those results later. And you need to be aware that a lot of the tools that you would use for something like this are going to be they're going to have some amount of overlap, both with tools that that actual hackers are going to use, but also with sort of security teams or people that do sort of security monitoring. It's going to be they're going to be using the same sort of tools that you would expect to see in a penetration test. So with that kind of out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about a couple of the requirements that you might have. So requirements for a penetration test can come from a couple different places. One of the things we've already talked about is the PCI DSS, and that's for places that are doing credit or debit cards. But there are a whole bunch of places, a whole bunch of sort of fields that have their own requirements that come from sort of if the government regulations or recommendations or corporate either that or corporate policy. But if you're looking at sort of the regulatory environment, PCI DSS is the only one the book has mentioned up until this point. But there's also something out there called HIPAA, which if you have gone to a doctor, one of the things that they make you sign at the beginning is a HIPAA form talking about how they're required to treat information. There are a couple other text that the textbook mentions. GLBA is one of the things that gets sort of the regulations that are used for financial institutions, and then there's something else called FISMA out there, and that's another thing that's sort of recommended from the federal government. One that you may have heard if you've been around, say, in the admissions office or financial aid at Calhoun, something called FERPA. There's actually regulations regarding how colleges are allowed to treat information. This is one of the reasons that we're not supposed to give you grades over the phone, or if we get a request from say one of your family members saying, hey, I'd like to know how so-and-so is doing in your class. We're not supposed to give that out. We're only supposed to give the grades to you. But those are the kind of things that get covered by any sort of regulatory requirement. There are a couple more details here for PCI DSS. This is there are some things in here that specifically talk about some of the way that penetration tests need to be done, and the way scans need to be done. And these are some of the sort of big points to come from PCI DSS. And you can see that there are some things here that are fairly vague. If we're saying well, you need to use qualified personnel, well, that's, I mean, who's the person that gets to decide what qualified personnel really means? There's a lot of sort of real-world experience and wisdom that isn't that's involved in taking these kind of requirements and sort of making them applicable in the real world. The other thing that I want you guys to be aware of is that PCI DSS and all the examples that we have given up until this point are all sort of examples of the regulatory environment. But there are going to be plenty of corporations out there that do not actually fall under one of those categories. There may not be regulations for, say, social media companies, for example. There's nothing that says that some place like Facebook has to protect your data in particular ways. On the other hand, they may have their own corporate policy that that talks about how they need to manage that. So the regulations that you're going to see from these things generally come from one of those two places, either the regulatory sort of environment or the corporate policies that the actual organization for which you're doing the penetration test has sort of given themselves, if that makes sense. There's a chart here. This comes from page 104 on your textbook, and this is something that's worth looking over carefully. I'm not going to read it to you, but what I want you to see here is that the security objectives that go down the left side of the screen here are the CIA triad. And then anytime you're doing any sort of having to justify penetration tests or any sort of budget that's expended on security. This is kind of the way that business people are going to look at this and say, well, what is the potential impact for one of these things, one of the aspects of the triad being compromised. And so if you have a low and a moderate impact, or a low, moderate, and a high impact potential outcome for each one of these security objectives, you can kind of trace out and see what exactly it's talking about. This is something that's worth looking at. So whenever you are trying to identify what sort of targets that you would scan, there are a couple things to keep in mind here. And what is the data classification? If you're doing anything with defense, we have in the defense industry, there's sort of pretty formalized ways of deciding what is what sort of what data sits at what classification level. There can be things that are corporate secrets but not government secrets. There can be things that are government secrets, and then there are sort of things that are sort of top secret government secrets, and all of these are sort of the level of classification of the data is determined by pretty much a chart that looks very similar to this. What would be the impact if it was released? But how vital that data is and how bad it would be if it got out is something that you're going to think about when you're deciding what targets to scan. Network exposure is going to be the same sort of thing here. If you have something that is an internal on an internal network and only accessible from there, well, that's going to be really different than something that actually has, say, public-facing IP addresses and could potentially get it'd be easier to compromise or easier for bad actors to scan. So services offered by system, what this is referring to is something, is the data on which this system resides. Is that also running, say, an FTP site or a web server or something like that? Generally, if you have a computer that offers a higher number of services, each one of those is a potential vulnerability. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Production versus test versus development environments. In the corporate world, particularly in government contracting, there are sort of wildly different rules that govern how things can be used on production versus test versus development environments. Something that is sent out to the Army and how they're using it in the field is sort of governed by one set of security rules. Something that's being worked on in a development environment, which is where most of us in Huntsville do our work, has a completely different set of rules, and that's kind of a response to what sort of threats would you expect each one of those things to encounter. This is another way of thinking about scan targets. There's the book makes reference to something that it sort of alternates between talking about an asset inventory or an asset map. If you have an asset inventory, that sort of just in general refers to a list of computers that are potential targets. And an asset map is going to be sort of a visualization of the asset inventory. So if you were trying to do a scan, this is kind of a way of seeing the results of an automated scan. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, how scans need to be automated and they need to be organized. This is a good way to see exactly what it is that you're trying to approach. But if you do a scan like this, it can give you a list of computers on the network and show you where everything is and kind of explain what services are running on each one. The last thing that we're going to talk about sort of during this part of this part of the video is this idea of scan frequency. There are how frequently something is scanned is something that is up to the constraints of the organization, and it's kind of worth thinking for a minute about what sort of things you're going to what's going to go into that decision. There's a concept that the book talks about that's called risk appetite, and risk appetite is how much risk an organization is willing to tolerate, and that sounds like something that we probably wouldn't want to tolerate at all, just in terms of, well, if I don't have to have any risk, then I don't want to have any risk at all. Why would I want any risk? Well, completely eliminating risk means that a lot of other things can't happen. If you want to make sure that none of your employees have workstations, say, that could potentially be hacked by somebody that's connecting through the internet, the only way to make them completely risk-proof, to mitigate all the risk, is to disconnect them from the internet. Well, that may be something that is going to cost you more than you're willing to pay to get that last little bit of risk reduced, if that makes sense. So when we're talking about risk appetite, we need to think of risk as something that we approach as a series of trade-offs. If I am willing to pay somebody to scan the network every day, well, that probably means my network usage is going to go up. I may need to build some redundancy into the corporate network. I've got to pay that guy to do it. The cost for that is going to be very large. If I only want to scan something once a year, then there's more risk that comes along with that. But there's also I'm going to spend less on scanning at the very least. But the takeaway here is that one of the things that goes into determining the scan frequency is the risk appetite. There are also some other aspects that can influence how frequently we would want to scan. If we are working in one of these industries in which there are regulatory requirements, it may be mandated that we have to scan at least once a year or after major changes or something like that. There may be technical constraints. In other words, if scanning absorbs enough network resources that it keeps everybody else from being able to do their job for a day, well, the company is probably not going to want to do that too frequently. Business constraints have to do with if the scans interfere with the normal business process. For example, if you were doing a security audit of a place that did tax preparation, they're probably not going to want you to do this the weekend before everybody's taxes are due. That anything where you're looking at things that are mandated by the business and deciding whether or not to interfere with that, that's referred to as a business constraint. If you have a licensing constraint, I think probably most of you know what this is. If you have a licensing constraint just trying to run something at your house, it means you're probably trying to run software for which you have not paid for a license. If you're in a corporate environment, the scanning software that you have may be limited to how many machines it can scan at a time. So that may be something that's something to consider. May take you longer to do a scan, which means that that it's going to cost more, and you probably don't want to do them as frequently under those sort of circumstances. And operational constraints have to do with sort of the constraints of the cybersecurity team. If your scans go quickly, but it takes your team a long time to analyze the results of those scans, that's something that's referred to as an operational constraint. So all of those things need to be balanced when you are when you're deciding how frequently to do scans. I think the last thing in this so actually no, wait a minute. This is actually just what we were talking about. The slides here seem to be out of order. And then the sort of results that you would get. Nessus is actually something that we futzed around with a little bit in the first half of this class. I don't know if you guys remember, but this is kind of what the beginning of a Nessus report looks like. And what we will talk about next is what it looks like to scope and execute vulnerability scans.